Welcome back to Motivation Mondays. Pew, 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 pew. This is where we reflect on the week that passed and think about all the things that we are grateful for, but also all the things that we would like to change in the week ahead. This is a judgment-free zone. Yes, we will get into some deep topics from time to time, and yes, we might, throw a few F-bombs here and there, just to let the bitches know. But at the end of the day, we're just here to encourage each other to try new things, be our best selves, and to be reminded that it's okay. In life, there are mistakes, And all we need to do is just try our best each day, put one foot in front of the other, and see where life takes us. So sit back, relax, and let's get into today's topic. Hello, lovers and friends. Good morning, good afternoon, good day. Today's topic is about grief. And this will be a two-part episode. One, because I think grief exists in many forms, and it's not just about, the death of someone important to us. But grief can also exist in the form of, the loss of a friendship or, grieving former versions of yourself that weren't as enlightened as you are now. And looking back at how much you suffered, right? Or grieving for your inner child and their unmet needs. It could be even things like, not getting the job that you wanted or losing your job or your marriage ending, and all these different things count as grief, right? But in the capitalist society that we live in, not all grief is acknowledged and given space, right? I want to give these two, types of grief, I guess. So these two different types of scenarios in which grief can come up, the space that it needs. I don't want our episodes to be too long. And I do know that the topic of grief is a heavy one, so I think it's best that we take it in small bites. So today I will be talking about, losing someone and, the death of relatives, friends, people who matter. And then next week I'll cover, the more intangible aspects of grief. Now, when it comes to losing someone who matters, right? I don't know if any of you have, but I have realized that, I'm getting to an age, or now that my birthday was this week, I'm a little more mature, I'm a little more, like just as the clock struck 12, this wisdom hit my body and, my eyes are open now. But jokes aside, I sort of kind of realized a couple of months ago, actually, that, as you get older, and now that we are sort of, older, that we're getting to that age where, grief and loss is a lot closer than we think, right? That not only are we experiencing it ourselves, but we're at that age where we're also comforting friends, and people who are close to us through their own grief. And yeah, it can be really difficult to go through it or to support someone through it, because you never really know what the right thing is to do, right, for yourself and for the people around you. But I think that it's important that through it all, much like with anything else in life, that being present helps, being present and being honest with yourself about how you feel, and allowing yourself to use that information to reassess what you can and cannot do to move forward. If moving forward is necessary, that's important, right? That's the least that we could do for ourselves. And unfortunately, society doesn't really advocate for or promote such, right? That to lose someone can really just knock the air out of your lungs. So I will tell you a few stories, ones of my own grief and of the people around me, right, that I've observed. So one, I remember when I was younger, so both of my grandfathers have passed away, and my one grandmother has passed away, and I'm left with just one. And when I was younger, I didn't really understand the concept of death. And when I was informed of my grandfather's passing, it didn't really register. I noticed all the people around me sort of being sad and, morose. And I remember seeing my mother cry for the first time ever. And it was all just very strange to me because I didn't realize that I'd never see him again. And my grandfather, I think, growing up was the only person who made me feel loved in an unconditional way, that he just cared, that my feelings mattered to him, and that he was even willing to defy my father's wishes to, give me something that I really wanted, and to make sure that I was happy and comfortable and included with my cousins and, within the family. And I loved him dearly. We only really saw my grandparents once a year, around the festive season. So this happening in the middle of the year, and I guess it could be that whole like object impermanence thing, where people don't really exist until like you see them. Like they exist in your mind, but they're kind of not real. And it's a hard thing to explain, but I really struggle to miss people when I'm like, you know what I mean? Because they're just not there, and I'm like, that's okay. I will see them wherever they exist. I will go to that place and find them there, and I just, generally don't have that like longing for someone. But what does happen is, in my mind sort of expects, that interaction is coming, and you anticipate it. And it only really hit me later as we were preparing to go, and make our annual, trek back home to visit relatives, that I'm like, oh, he's not going to be there. And I burst out in tears. And by then, everyone had moved on, right? They had worked through their grief in whatever way that they had, and I was the last one to the party. And everyone was kind of now surprised by, why am I crying about it now? Like, he's been gone. But for me, he wasn't. He was still there, right? Just waiting, right? Like he always was. In December, at the stoop, outside with a couple of beers, and that he would welcome us with a smile. And I remember us driving up to the house and just seeing the empty chair, and it finally became real, and that's grief sometimes, it doesn't really always hit you immediately, and that just because you're not reacting the way that everyone else is reacting, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're not feeling it, it doesn't necessarily mean that you didn't love the person, that you didn't care, that this loss won't affect you. But sometimes, the mind is a really strange thing, and there could be a variety of factors that contribute to this delayed response, right? And even if you do react immediately in the moment and then you think you're over it and you think you've moved on, but then you get these reminders, you have these moments where something funny happens and your first thought is to, message or call, right? Now, something that you used to do with them, you have to do alone, right? Or you're now asking someone else to help you, and there's that pang of grief again, and it's like they've died all over again, and you're overwhelmed with all this grief, and it's a lot. I don't think grief ever really goes away. My grandfather passed away so many years ago. Passed away in 2004, so almost 20 years now. And I was so small at the time, you'd think that, like, what do you really miss? You know what I mean? Like, come on. What could you possibly be missing when you barely, like, you've lived the majority of your life without him? But he mattered. He mattered to me. And my life will always have something missing because I have spent the majority of my life without him, So, yeah, I tell that story to say that grief can come in waves and that it doesn't always have to hit you immediately, that a lot of time can pass. I know years passed without me thinking of him or being able to talk about him without being brought to tears. And I'm a lot better now, right? We can laugh and share stories, and, he can exist within our memories and in conversation, and it's not, a sorrowful affair. We can laugh now. But it doesn't mean that now that we've gotten to that point where we can laugh about it, that we're not allowed to cry about it. And yeah, you might find that in this capitalist society, it sounds silly to want to ask for a day off, right? A mental health day, because today, for whatever reason, you find yourself missing someone who, yes, passed away many years ago, but that grief is just a little too heavy to carry today, that you're usually able, to take it in stride, and that you carry it along with everything else that you carry in your life, and that you have built up, the strength to carry this grief, right? But today it's just particularly heavy, and you need a moment to like sit down and deal with this grief and build up the strength to carry it again. But you've got KPIs to meet. You have a meeting at 12. How do you even begin to have that conversation with your manager, who very well could watch your arm be decapitated by a falling ceiling fan, and will still tell you that, why don't you know how to write with your left hand, because your productivity has gone down. And it's honestly a really silly excuse that you're going to blame the loss of your arm for the lack of the report being on time. So if you're dealing with people who are so cutthroat, or if you are working in an environment that is so intense, there's no room for you and your grief. And in general, in society, that's how things go from a day-to-day basis, right? People ask, hey, how are you? But they don't really mean it. They don't stop to ask the question. They say it in passing while walking past, as if it goes along with the hello. And it's just to acknowledge that I saw you. But I'm not actually acknowledging your personhood. So yeah, so screw you and your grief. Life must move on. And yes, it must. You must move on. You have a life that needs living, and you cannot always wallow in grief, but you do not have to ignore it entirely and pretend that it never happened. To appease who exactly? This capitalist regime, because it makes other people uncomfortable? Why? Why can't we sit in our grief whenever it arises, whenever it overwhelms us, when the waves crash at shore and they're a lot bigger than the little ripples that usually trickle in, why? Why can't we just take that moment? Will the world really fall apart if I take this moment for myself? And unfortunately, we've been made to believe that yes, the world will fall apart. You will lose your job, right? You will lose the respect of your peers and the people around you if you're constantly harping on this issue. Like, oh my gosh, get over it. And that doesn't matter. Other people and their discomfort with your grief is not your business, right? Their inability to hold space for you is not your business. Sometimes we have to acknowledge that we are living in a hostile environment and we cannot wait for the people or the systems around us to give us permission to grieve, to give us the time that we need to process our feelings when we are going through such big things, that sometimes we just have to take that time. We have to finagle the system in some way, right? You take your 3 days plus a couple of sick days and look at your budget to see if you can afford a couple of unpaid days. Whatever. Do what you can to give yourself the time that you need to grieve. And with that being said, there's also a privilege. There's also a privilege that comes with being able, right, to finagle the system and carve out some time for yourself, because, sometimes these things come where we have people who are relying on us. If you have kids, if you're not in a financial position to afford the extra days, if you are working, as like a casual worker or a domestic worker or so on, where that you can be replaced and that they are more than happy to replace you, right? That you do kind of have to keep pushing. But what I can say is that in those moments, do not do yourself the disservice of trying to ignore your feelings, right? Look at your day and find moments where you can soothe yourself, right? You don't have to be the person that they expect you to be. You don't have to consider other people's feelings and how maybe you coming into work and not being all chipper and stuff, how that might make other people feel, that people are expecting you to, be all sunshine and rainbows. So you have to put on a brave face and pretend like nothing happened. You don't have to grieve privately, to come home and take off the mask and finally let yourself cry. What is wrong with being honest and genuine about how you're feeling in this moment? When somebody asks you, oh, hey, how are you? I'm not okay. And that can be the answer. when they, pop over to your desk and, say, hey, you seem strange. Are you okay? And oftentimes people just ask that question to, soothe themselves, right? To rid themselves of any potential guilt they might have for not asking, but they don't actually want to know the answer. And who cares? They asked, right? So answer truthfully. I'm not okay. I'm grieving a loss. And it's going to take me some time to go back to normal. If I will ever go back to normal, I might be forever changed by this loss, because it was a great loss. So this is where I am right now. This work environment, my contract, whatever, society doesn't allow me to take the time that I need, take the time that I want, to grieve this loss privately. So I will continue to do my job. I will continue to show up and do what I am contracted to do. But what you're not going to do, what I am not going to do, is pretend like everything is okay for your comfort, because it's not okay. And I do not have the energy to grieve and to put on a facade. This grief is not one that I can hide, and nor should any of my grief be hidden, because it is part of life. It is just part of life. So here you are, in the privileged position to bear witness to my life. So next time you want to ask these questions, really be prepared for the answer, because this is going to be my answer for a while. And if that makes you uncomfortable, then I suggest you look within yourself and deal with that on your own. You know what I mean? Because that is also an example of how we can advocate for ourselves in hostile environments, right? That just because society won't let you take the time, it doesn't mean that you have to do so with a smile. You have to suffer under this regime with a smile. It's okay to grieve. It's okay to let people see you grieving. And it's okay to respond to grief in any way that feels right to you. Obviously, I don't mean now turning into a murderer, causing harm to other people in the name of grief, right? You don't have complete carte blanche. We still live in a society with rules. But focus on yourself. Focus on your healing. Focus on building up the strength that it takes to carry this loss with you, because it's not going anywhere. The person that you've lost is not suddenly coming back. They're not on a sabbatical. They're gone forever. And it sucks. It fucking sucks. So deal with it in whichever way that you can, and don't let other people police you in your grief, because it's not their grief, it's yours, and you will process it in whichever way that you know how, whichever way that you can. At work, well, I'm fortunate enough to work for an organization that allows people to take as much time as they need to grieve these losses, but that's not the case for everyone. So it's important to make room for yourself in whichever way that you can. And that defiance can be a way of you honoring this loss, right? That sometimes sitting, and just stewing in this grief is sometimes unhealthy and sometimes not the best way for you personally to process things. And that's fine. Find a way that works for you. If it means telling anyone that makes eye contact with you, you step in and you tell them, hey, I've lost someone and I need you to bear witness, then sure. If you do want to keep it to yourself and hold on to this grief because it is the last thing that this person you loved gave you, then that's also fine, for now. But we do what we can to get ourselves to a point where we can put one foot in front of the other, and that will look different for everyone. But at the end of the day, your grief is valid. Your grief matters, and you deserve to be comforted. You deserve to be seen, and there's nothing about your grief that is wrong, in spite of how it might make other people feel. Now, on the flip side of this, talking about, being the friend or the one who is comforting someone through their grief, that can be very difficult, right? It can be really difficult because you never really know what to do. Comforting someone through grief is really painful and really disempowering because there's nothing you can do, and it is very difficult to bear witness to someone's grief. But if you, are up to the task, then by all means, be there, comfort your friends, but also be honest with yourself. If you do not have the emotional capacity to support your friend or someone you love through a difficult time, you don't have to overextend yourself, right? You don't have to burn yourself out to help console them through this grief. Do what you can. If it is too difficult for you to be around them because maybe it triggers something about grief of your own, or it triggers a fear that you might have, for losing people who matter in your life or whatever, right? You're not a super emotional person, so it's hard for you to be confronted with so many emotions. That is okay. You could cook meals for them at home and come by and drop them off, write notes, send them messages. Do what you can, if you can, and if you want to do something, right? But I think part of having these people that we care about in our lives is to be with them through the good and the bad, right? But it doesn't mean that now, because you love them and because you care about them, that you have to neglect yourself and your needs. I think, even reflecting on my own life, there have definitely been times where, people that I've cared about, friends of mine, have gone through really big losses. And I haven't been in a position where I could show up for them in the way that I even wanted to show up for them, because at the time I was going through my own things and was overwhelmed by my own struggles and stresses, and I was not in a position, and I didn't have the emotional bandwidth to put my issues aside to then, show up for them fully, right? And it feels selfish, and I felt so guilty, right, for not being able to be there for them, to save them from their grief. But if we're being honest, there was no way that I could save them from it, right? Yes, being seen and being comforted helps, right? But I did the best that I could at the time. I didn't ignore my friend. I didn't, dismiss the fact that they were going through that grief. But I did what I could. And as time went on and I was able to address my own issues, I was then able to show up more for them. But I know that had I tried to push myself beyond my capabilities, right, to just be a martyr for this friendship because my friend needs me, I know that I would have done myself a disservice, and it might have ended up resulting in me resenting my friend now, right? because my life now is in shambles because of you, right? When it's actually because of a choice I made. I chose to prioritize someone else's needs over my own. And I'm grateful for the fact that I've gotten to that point now where I can sort of console myself through the guilt of not being able to show up for people in the way that I would like to. But it comes with knowing that when I am able, I know myself enough to know that I will always show up in the best way that I can every single time. And sometimes my best just looks different depending on where I am at life. Because in the past, I did overextend myself and, burnt myself out trying to show up for other people and be their heroes. And I left myself drowning, right, trying to pull other people out. When now, as I've, been more honest with myself and tried to accommodate my needs as well as the needs of the people that I care about, that my efforts do not go unnoticed, and the people who care about me don't feel entitled to any particular type of care, right? That they're just like, oh, well, why didn't you book me a room at a hotel and a spa treatment and, foot massages, and why didn't you carry me from my bed to the bathroom? Like, no, they're also reasonable people, right? Who understand that life is a lot. And I often found that in those moments, right, maybe later on when we're talking and our lives have settled a bit more, that they also sort of share a similar sentiment in not being able to show up for me because they were overwhelmed by their own grief. And my response is, oh no, friend, like, you're going through a lot. There's no way I'd expect you, to do all of that for me and then some. So, if I know myself and my character and the fact that I wouldn't expect my friends to overextend myself, you also need to trust that your friends also care about you enough to not sit around expecting you to set yourself on fire to keep them warm. But it does require checking in with yourself. It does require you acknowledging the brevity of what you're about to step into, right? That it's not just, hey girl, I had a really bad day at work today. This is some really deep and serious shit. I've been in the room when a friend found out about the passing of a parent, and that scream that they let out was gut-wrenching. I've never heard a scream like that before, and in some ways it still rings in my ears. And obviously in that moment, right, because it happened right in front of me and we were with, a group of people and whatever, we all sort of, just immediately went into comfort mode and helped her in the best way that we could in that moment, right, and consoled her and stayed over and, did all of those things. But eventually, I had to leave and had to sort out my own things, right? And having had that moment to step away and actually now check in with myself, I was like, wow, that's a lot, and I'm drained. I'm really emotionally drained. I don't know if I have the energy to go back and to continue to support her today. Maybe I should just take today to recharge my energy so that I can go back and really be present for her. And that was also a very difficult decision to make. And I know that at the time, the people who were in that group, on the first day when she found out, they, judged me a little for not showing up the next day, right? But 2 days later I came back, and at that point they were completely drained, right? they had nothing left in the tank and they were running on fumes. They had overextended themselves and they couldn't return to support her, right? And that, was, I guess, timed perfectly in the sense that I could show up and support her at that time, right? And sometimes if you do, operate in a friendship group, that you could consider and have those conversations with each other that, like, listen, this is a lot for any one of us to have to deal with and to carry and to bear witness. So let's coordinate with each other so that we can, as a support team, support each other in this process. And sometimes, even if you're not part of a friendship group, if you have other friends in your life, you can let them know, like, hey, that friend of mine, so and so, they're going through a lot right now. And yeah, I really want to support them through this, but I think it's going to, affect me in some way. And I'm asking for your support in order for me to support them. I would like help with maybe thinking of things that I could do, for them. Could you help me research, counselors and so on and so forth? And could you help maybe alleviate the mental labor or the mental load of, thinking about things to do while I carry the emotional load, of being there and comforting. But having a support network around you can help you show up better for your friends, right? To show up for the people that you care about. But in everything, whether it is you experiencing the grief or if you are supporting someone through it, be honest. Be honest with yourself. Be honest with your feelings. Be honest about where you are in your process, in your healing journey. So that you can process things better, so that you can be of service to yourself and the people around you, so that you can allow people to have, clear expectations of what they can get out of you in those moments, right? That by not hiding your grief and by being honest about the fact that you are still grieving and that your grief has affected you in particular ways, that you allow the people around you to give you the space that you need. That if you're not in an environment that is kind, if the systems that you operate under are cold, right, and don't take life, right, into consideration, that the people that you are in this system with, that these people can create that space for you, right? And just by speaking up for yourself, you are invariably creating that space for yourself anyway. So, yeah, I think I'll end it there for today. Next week, we'll talk about the more intangible versions of grief, right? And how sometimes we minimize those things and dismiss our feelings in that regard, but that grief is valid too. So we'll talk about that next week. But this week, I just want our homework to be to check in with ourselves, to see where we are at any given moment in time, that before we volunteer ourselves to be of service to the people around us, be it through comforting them through grief, be it through anything, that we check in with ourselves first, right? And see, like, am I in a position, do I have the capacity to hold space for this person right now? And if not, then that's okay. And in the most respectful way possible, you say, I'm so sorry. I know that this is important to you, and your feelings are important to me too, that I want to be there for you, but right now I'm not in a position to be able to do so fully. So could you maybe just send me a voice note? I still if this is just something you want to be heard, could you please send me a voice note? And when I find myself in a position where I have the bandwidth, I will listen to it, right? Can I just give you a hug, right? Can I just hold you? That's all I can do right now, Or can can we talk about this at another time? Can I refer you to someone? Maybe we should rather have this conversation over the phone. Let's talk this evening over the phone, where maybe there's a bit of a space or a gap between us, so that I don't feel so overwhelmed, right? This topic right now is actually really triggering for me, and it's not something that I can support you through, because it's triggering issues of my own, and I don't want to conflate, I don't want to project my issues, my grief, my trauma onto you and your situation, because your situation deserves to be seen for what it is and heard in its entirety. And I don't think that I've gotten through my own healing enough to be able to make space for you and your story. So I'm really sorry, but I don't think I can support you through this particular issue right now. I'm not saying I never want to support you or that I don't want to support you in future. This particular topic, I just can't. I can't hold this for you, And it can be hard to say. It's definitely hard to hear. But if your relationship is predicated on love and respect, then there is room to come back from this, even if it feels really uncomfortable. You can come back and recover, right, from this, and say, okay, you can still check in and say, have you found someone you can talk to? Because I want you to be heard. It just can't be me. Can I refer you? What can I do to support you without actually having to bear witness or to listen to the details of this? Would you like me to contact a lawyer for you? Is there sort of like administrative work that you need done that I could maybe do without having to deal with, this? Whatever, right? I'm not saying that not being in a position to help and support means that you have to relinquish all responsibility or, just divorce yourself of everything. You can find other ways to show up for them based on what your capacity is at the time. But you have to check in with yourself, because being willing doesn't always mean that you are able. And that is an important distinction to make, because this is how we burn out. This is how we find ourselves overextending ourselves, because we think that our willingness will immediately generate the ableness, which is not true. Our willingness comes from our love and our care for that person, right? So that willingness will always be there. But the ability to be there will always be in flux, depending on where we are in our lives. And that we shouldn't feel guilty about being less able this time than we were last time, right? So, yes, I'm not going to harp on this topic very long, because I had really hoped this week's episode would be a short one, but grief is not short. Grief is not brief. So I would like to honor the topic. And like I said, next week we will continue to speak about grief, but from a different perspective. And yeah, I really hope that this week's homework of checking in with ourselves before availing ourselves to people is something that hopefully gets us in the habit of being more attuned to our feelings and our emotional states at all times, and not just when other people need us, right? But being ever present and, being always aware of where we are mentally, physically, and emotionally, so that we can also address our own issues and meet our own needs as they come up. That sometimes we do live in a world where we ignore ourselves, and it's only when these, stresses come up that it exposes us for, where we actually at. We thought that everything was Gucci, but we've actually been running on fumes for some time now, and now our friend needs us, and we're surprised that we don't have the capacity to be there for them, right? So as much as it is, this week's homework is specifically related to showing up for other people, I do think that it's a good practice to have in general. I love you very much, and thank you for listening. Alrighty, thank you so much for listening to this week's episode. I really appreciate it. I know it was a bit on the somber side of life. Next week's episode won't be as somber, mostly because we won't be talking about death, but it will still be, a serious one and one to, reflect on. But I'm looking forward to it, and I would just like to say, yay us. We have crossed the 10 episode mark. We're already, this is episode 11. And I think that's a big deal. I think that's a very big deal. And one that's worthy of celebrating, hint, hint, nudge, nudge, last week's episode. But I'm really looking forward to the topics that we have down the line and the new additions to the podcast. So yeah, stick around, share your comments and your opinions, and we will see you next week. Bye-bye.